Okay, this week's Sedras Parshas Teruma, which focuses the first of a number of Sedras that focus about the Mishkan, which was the predecessor to the Beis Hamikdash. And there seems to be a machlokes as to what the purpose of the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash was. Now, the Rambam, the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka says that the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash, he doesn't say the Mishkan, but it seems from his words that the same applies to the Mishkan, that the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to build a house for God, that it should be a set place to give korbanos, sacrifices, and to come there, aliyah l'regel, 3 times a year. And this is all included in the mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash, the Rambam says. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, I wouldn't say gives a different explanation, but is more at length about it. And the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that the Jewish people, to a certain degree, because they were involved in idolatry previously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to wean them off idolatry, and their perception of worship manifests itself in korbanos. This is the famous opinion of the Rambam. And because of that, God said, use in some form, that form of worship, that which you understand as being worship, and turn it in dedication and devotion to me. And the ultimate purpose was to wean the Jewish people away from idolatry. And of course, this is a very controversial idea that the Rambam expresses, that the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim goes further, and he says it's because of that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded, that the Torah commands, that the luchos, the aron with the luchos, should be put in the Beis Hamikdash, because the opening commandments of the luchos was Anochi Hashem and Lo Yihya Lecha Elohim Acherim Al Panai. So you should do the avoda in a place where the luchos are, which emphasizes the sin of idolatry. This is how the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim explains the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash and the keeping of the Aron with the luchos in the Beis Hamikdash. However, and the Rambam goes further, and he says that the Kruvim, the 2 human-like figures, figures with wings on them that were on top of the Aron and on the side of the Aron in the Beis Hamikdash as well. So these figures with their wings represent the angels. And why is it? In other words, because the halacha wanted to emphasize the importance of belief in the Nevi'im and prophecy, because the Torah has its origin and its perpetuation in the continuation of in Nevuah, in prophecy. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, is the Adon HaNeviim, the master of the Neviim. So because of that, whereas God spoke to Moshe like a person speaks to his friend, peh al peh, but to Nevi'im, God spoke through an angel. And you see, because the Rambam very often does not take angels literally, people are of the opinion that the Rambam did not believe in the existence of angels, which is of course ridiculous. Perhaps the perception of angels, the way we perceive angels was different. But the Rambam clearly, you see from the Moreh Nevuchim here and in other places as well, the Rambam certainly did believe in the idea of angels who would appear to the Nevi'im and to give over the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the kruvim, the human-like figures that were erected near the Aron, they represented the Nevi'im. The Rambam goes further and he asks the question: why was it necessary to have it represented the angels who conveyed the message of God to the Nevi'im, to the prophets? And the truth of the matter is, sometimes a prophet the prophet is an agent of God, just as the angel is an agent of God. Now, we could suggest also, this the Rambam doesn't mention the Moreh Nevuchim, but based on what the Rambam says previously, that the reason to give significance to the idea to the Nevi'im who were instructed, who received instructions from angels, was because of the role that the Nevi'im played in the weaning of the Jew from idolatry. The Nevi'im, time and time again, would say, yes, you're giving korbanos, but if you do not have the proper attitude, lama li rov zedcheichem, mi pi keishem miyetchem. God does not see korbanos as an end in itself. God is not pleased with korbanos. The purpose of korbanos was to wean the Jew away from idolatry. And who is it that says time and time again, warning the Jew, do not feel that you fulfill your commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to the Torah with the korbanos alone? It was the Nevi'im. So we could possibly suggest, in line with what the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, that it was important to have the luchos in the Beis HaMikdash, which emphasized lo yeh lecha lehim acherim al panai, an emphasis on the importance of the Nevi'im who received their instructions from angels, because it was the Nevi'im who time and time again let the Jewish people know that the korbanos are not to be seen as an end in themselves. So, but the Ramban seems to have a different opinion as to what the purpose of the Mishkan, or what the purpose of the Mishkan was, and the assumption is the same thing he would say in regard to the Beis HaMikdash. The Ramban says that the purpose of the Mishkan was to have a place for the Aron, And of course, God would reveal himself to Moshe Rabbeinu from atop of the Aron, but he would speak from atop of the Aron. But it was to have a special place. Yes, there was avoda there, there was the karbanos there, but it was only because the purpose of the Mishkan was because of the Aron, because of the ark that contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Now, but there is a question that is asked regarding this opinion of the Ramban. And that question is because in Bayesheni, during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, so the Bayesheni, the Aron wasn't in its place. The Aron was hidden. We paskin that it was hidden in a chamber below the Beis Hamikdash. So if the whole purpose of the Beis Hamikdash and of the Mishkan was to have a place for the Luchos and for the Aron, why is it that they built the second Beis Hamikdash? So we could answer that in one of two ways. One is we need a place for the Aron, for the Luchos. It's indicative of the fact that we are looking forward to the return of the Luchos, to the return of the Aron. Even in Bayesheni, there was a avoda that was done inside the Kodesh Kodashim by the place, the Makom HaAron. So there was significance to the idea that there was a place for the Aron, for the Beis Hamikdash. But we could say something else, and that is that the Rambam in Hilchos Beis Hamchira, so he mentions that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, knew that ultimately the Beis Hamikdash would be destroyed. And because of this, he built a lower chamber underneath the Kodesh Kodashim, where the Aron, together with the Man, together with the Mata Aron, were hidden. And at the end of Bayesheni, Yoshiyahu hid the Aron. It was probably on the basis of prophecy, probably given to Huldah, to one of the prophets at that time, and the Aron was taken the way we paskin. The Aron was taken to the lower chamber of the Beis Hamikdash, and I saw in the notes of my uncle Shiurim, and I saw it also. The same idea was expressed by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in one of his sichos. They were troubled. It's not the derech of the Rambam to talk history. In Hilchos Chanukah, the Rambam does give a brief summary of the events that initiated the celebration of Chanukah. That was the cause of the celebration of Chanukah. But besides everything else, Chanukah is a mitzvah pesumei nisa. And consequently, it's important to know from a halachic perspective, what was the reason for the miracle of Chanukah and why we are celebrating. But the question is, I mean, they didn't mention about Hanukkah. I'm just putting that in. But the question is, why is it that the Rambam here tells us about Shlomo? He could just say that the Aron was hidden, or it was hidden in a lower chamber. Why did he have to go and to explain that Shlomo HaMelech dug a lower chamber when he built the base of Mikdash to hide the Aron? So both my uncle and the Lubavitcher Rebbe said the reason the Rambam mentions that it was done by Shlomo HaMelech is to emphasize that lower chamber was considered as part of the Beis HaMikdash also. In other words, there were two places for the Aron in the Beis HaMikdash. So since there were two places for the Aron in the Beis HaMikdash, now that's why Shlomo HaMelech is the one who built the Beis HaMikdash. The lower chamber wasn't made at a later date when it became necessary to hide the Aron, but it was made as part of the Beis HaMikdash. So to a certain degree, even though the Aron and the Luchos were not revealed during Bayis Sheni, but it never really left the Beis HaMikdash. The Aron is still there in the Beis HaMikdash today. Even though most of the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, that one chamber is still there. So in a sense, we could say that the Ramban held like the Rambam in this respect. So the Beis HaMikdash served even during Bayis Sheni. Even Bayis Sheni, it served as the even during Bayis Sheni, it was the place for the Aron. But it's also interesting, being the place for the Aron, the Ramban is l'shitaso, is in accordance with another thought that the Ramban expresses in the Hagdama to Chumash Mos, in his introduction to his commentary on Chumash Mos, and also in Parshas Teruma. The Ramban says that the topic, so if I could say, of Chumash Mos is the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim, and Matan Torah. And he's troubled as to why, I have mentioned this many times in the past, he's troubled as to why the second half of Chumash Mos, which talks about the construction of the Mishkan, is included in Chumash Mos. He doesn't say this, but the implication is it would have probably been better to be in the Chumash Vayikra that deals with the avoda, that deals with the service. And the Ramban says that the purpose of the Mishkan was to serve as a vehicle to transfer the Kedusha, the sanctity of Mount Sinai, and bring it to Yerushalayim, Teretz Yisrael, where it will permanently be part of the Beis HaMikdash. What is the idea that the Ramban is expressing? What the Ramban is expressing is that the Beis HaMikdash, and to a certain degree the Mishkan, was to serve as the perpetuation of Matan Torah. That Matan Torah, in a sense, when the Jew went to the Beis HaMikdash, he was re-experiencing Matan Torah. He was returning to Har Sinai, halachically, figuratively. And it's very interesting. And the Rashi at the beginning of Shemos Rashi at the beginning of Shemos says, excuse me, at the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, he says, why is it that Parshas Mishpatim is mentioned immediately after the end of Parshas Yisro, which talks about the construction of the Mizbeach? So he says it is to let us know that the Bezdin Hagadol, which is represented by Ve'ela HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lefneihem, these are the Mishpatim that you shall place before them. And who is this? This is, I assume that this is what this Medrash that Rashi brings is based on. This is being told to Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, as I'll mention soon, the Gemara mentions, he was like the Bezdin Hagadol. He was like the Bezdin Hagadol. The Bezdin Hagadol was in place of Moshe. So it talks about the obligation of Bezdin Hagadol to judge and teach Torah. And where did Bezdin Hagadol fulfill its obligation of judging? And by the way, judgment and teaching Torah went hand in hand. It wasn't like today that you have a yeshiva and you have a bezdin. But the way Torah was learned in those days, it was learned through observation, seeing how the Bezdin Hagadol or other Batidinim operated. This is the way that, as a matter of fact, at the beginning of Mishpatim, it says that even if you go to a court a secular court, but you don't comply, so it's Kilu Meirim Yad Neged Torah Moshe. Why? Because this is the way Torah was given over. If unfortunately, but they didn't use other criteria, I don't know that we could say that this is the way Torah was given over. But so the obligation of the Bezdin was to teach Torah and to judge, and the two went hand in hand. And the Bezdin Hagadol had to sit near the Mizbeach. Near the Mizbeach means in the Beis HaMikdash. According to the Rambam, that's very easily understood, because the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash was to serve as a place for avodah, as a place for giving korbanos, of giving sacrifices, as I mentioned. So, but what's the idea behind it? What's the idea behind this medrash that the Beis Hamikdash, that the Bezdin Hagadol had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash next near the Mizbeach? Could be near the Mizbeach means in the Beis Hamikdash, because the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to do the sacrifices, to do the avodah, which was done on the Mizbeach. But what's the idea behind it? The idea behind it is that the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to be the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And we say that Moshe Kishim V'chad Kahi, Moshe Rabbeinu had a din like the Bezdin Hagadol, had the status of Bezdin Hagadol. Now I don't know whether it's a halacha that Moshe had a din like the Bezdin Hagadol, like the High Court of Israel, or on the contrary, the High Court of Israel had a din like Moshe Rabbeinu. It might be dependent. There's some discussion in the notes of the Brisker Rav Shiurim. He mentions that my grandfather had suggested that when did Moshe have a din of Bezdin Hagadol? When he had two other people with him, because he gave the Bezdin Hagadol that special. He gave when he was part of a Bezdin, the Bezdin had the status of a Bezdin Hagadol. But when he wasn't, but otherwise you needed Shivim Skenim. You need Shivim Skenim. So according to that, I would say that the Bezdin Hagadol, that Moshe Rabbeinu was in place of the Bezdin Hagadol. However, a person could suggest that the Bezdin Hagadol was in place of Moshe. Now, if you say that Bezdin Hagadol was in place of Moshe, we can understand the medrash that Rashi brings down, because the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim says that when Bezdin Hagadol made a psak, when the Bezdin Hagadol decided a certain question, so we had to see that as something that was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. And we could say that's the reason why the Bezdin Hagadol had to sit in the Lishkas HaGazis in the Beis HaMikdash, because the Beis HaMikdash was in place, being the perpetuation of Matan Torah. The Beis HaMikdash was in place of Mount Sinai, and the Bezdin Hagadol was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. This way, it would be easier to identify the psak, the decision of Bezdin Hagadol, as something that was given to Moshe at Har Sinai. So this is now, however, if we accept, this is the explanation. With this explanation, we could explain this medrash. However, if we accept the Ramban, so the Ramban Shita is that if we accept this, that the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash was to be the perpetuation of Matan Torah. So we could understand the idea of the Kruvim being Pnei Mishalachim, that their faces faced one another. Why are the faces faced? So the Gemara asks a contradiction, because the pasuk in Yoel says Upnei Mishal Abayis. So the Gemara says Kan Osin Ritzono Shamakom, Kanein Osin Ritzono Shamakom. When the Jewish people did the will of God, so the two faces of the Kruvim, of the two angelic figures, or human figures with wings on them, that were in the Holy of Holies, that were on the Aron, that were on the side of the Aron, would face each other. But at a time that the Jewish people were not doing the will of God, so they would show their backs to each other, and they would face the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. Seems very strange that the sign for not doing the will of God is facing the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. How are we to understand it? But I want to suggest in Parshas Yisrael, the Torah tells us, Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahor, that the Jewish people, they rested, or they set up camp at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, and it used the singular form. And the Medrash says everywhere else it says Vayachanu. In the plural form, they set up camp in the plural form. But at Mount Sinai, they set up camp in the singular form. Why? They were Ke'ish Echad B'Lev Echad. They were one person with one heart. And the Medrash says, why were they like one person with one heart? Because they were like one person with one heart. Excuse me, the Medrash says, God said, let me use this opportunity to give them the Torah. And the question is, why was this a prerequisite for the Jewish people getting the Torah, that they should be like one person with one heart? But the answer is, when the Jewish people accepted the Torah, they didn't just accept the Torah for themselves. They accepted the Torah they accept the Torah for all the Jews. You can't accept something for somebody else. But if you're like one person with one heart, then you could accept you. It's like you're accepting for yourself as well. And this is the idea. But the ger, the potential ger who came to Hillel, and he said to Hillel, I want to become a Jew, but teach me the whole Torah on 1 foot. And Hillel said, what you don't want for yourself, don't do for somebody else. That's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your friend like yourself. And Rabbi Akiva said that a great principle of the Torah is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your friend like yourself, or as if yourself. So what's the idea? The idea is that when someone becomes a ger, so in a sense, he has to undergo the experience of Matan Torah. We say there's Kabbalah's mitzvos. He accepts mitzvos. But the Jewish people at the time of Matan Torah, when they accepted the mitzvos, they didn't just accept the mitzvos for themselves. They accepted it for all the other Jews as well. Why? Because they were ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. They were like one person with one heart. So v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is the foundation of the whole Torah. Why is the foundation of the whole Torah? It could be the foundation of mitzvahs bein adam l'chavera, between mitzvahs between one person and another. But how is it the foundation of the mitzvahs bein adam l'makom, between man and man? But it's the foundation of the mitzvahs between man and God. Excuse me. How is it the foundation of the mitzvahs between man and God? The answer is, God wants us to accept the Torah not just for ourselves, but God wants us to accept the Torah for all of the Jewish people. So because of this, the idea of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that represents the idea of ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. It represents the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And that's why Osin Ritzon Shamakom, the two human-like figures, we could say, represent the Jewish people, according to the Ramban. They represent the Jewish people, and in a sense, the Jewish people accept the Torah when they were ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. So pnei mishalachiv, when they face each other, that's indicative of Osin Ritzon Shamakom, because we have to perpetuate Matan Torah. And we can perpetuate Matan Torah when we're ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, when we're like one person with one heart. Now, but the question is, now it's interesting that the Rambam in the Hilchos Beis HaBchira, the Rambam's opinion is that the mitzvah of building Basli Mikdash Shachanti B'Socham, the mitzvah of building the Mishkan and building the Mikdash, incorporated in it the mitzvah of making all the utensils of the Beis HaMikdash. And he lists the 7 utensils of the Beis HaMikdash, the Mizbeach, the menorah, etc. But he does not mention the menorah, the Aron. He does not list the Aron there. And the question is raised, why doesn't he list the Aron there? And the answer my uncle gave is that the Aron was not a Klei HaMikdash. We would put the Aron in the Beis HaMikdash, but it was not one of the utensils of the Beis HaMikdash. The matter of fact, you see that at least according to one opinion, the Aron, when the Jewish people went to war, they would take the Aron with them. So the Aron was not considered a utensil of the base of Mikdash. That was just the place that we put the Aron in. But the Aron itself was a separate mitzvah. As a matter of fact, it's interesting when you take a look at the psukim. So we say va'asuli mikdash in the plural, va'asu, and va'asu Aron atzei shitim. And regarding the other things, it says it says that they should make, but not in the plural form. So the question is, why does it say it? It's in other words, because when it came to the other utensils, so vasisa, it says vasisem. All right, I'm sorry to get a little confused. The Aron is used the same terminology for the making of the Aron is the same terminology used for the creation of the Mishkan. So because it represents its own mitzvah, because the Aron was not considered a klei hamikdash. It's for asu. It's for asu. So the question is, now, and with this we can really understand. The Gemara says that the Aron did not occupy space of the Beis Hamikdash, because there was 10 amos on each side of the Aron, there was no space. There was no space for the Aron itself. Miraculously, it fit in an area of no space. And the question is, how is it that it fit into an area of no space? But I think the reason it had to be that way was because the Aron was not a klei hamikdash. So in order to emphasize that the Aron was not a klei hamikdash, so because of that, it fit into an area where there was no space. Now the question is, if it was not a klei hamikdash, it wasn't a utensil of the Beis Hamikdash. So the question is, how are we to understand the Rashi, the Medrash? Rashi cites the beginning of Mishpatim. How are we to understand that Medrash? The Medrash says that the Bezdin Hagadol had to sit next to the Mizbeach. We understood it that it's the perpetuation of Matan Torah. But if the Aron was not a klei hamikdash, so in a sense, we can't say that it was the perpetuation of Matan Torah. So how could we say that the Beis Hamikdash? So how are we to understand that the Bezdin Hagadol had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash? Now, I think that the way we can understand it is with the Rambam Shita. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, "Zel lechaos ki anochi shlachticha, v'hotziacha esam tavdin osi al b'makom hazeh." That when you take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, you will serve me here, and that was Mount Sinai. So, in other words, the Jewish people at Mount Sinai had to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They served HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Because Har Sinai wasn't just the giving of karbanos. Har Sinai was also the place where it wasn't just the giving of the Torah, Har Sinai was also the place where the Karbanos were given. The Karbanos were given in Har Sinai. This was the Avdos of Klal Yisrael. What was the Avdos of Klal Yisrael? An Eved doesn't just have obligations to his master. The Eved belongs to his master. My uncle in one of his shiurim asked a question. It says Na'aseh v'nishma. What does it mean, Na'aseh v'nishma? And it also says Na'aseh. So first they accepted the obligations, but then when they said Na'aseh v'nishma, they accepted to be avodim, to be servants of God, to be slaves of God. They belong to God. So Har Sinai represents not just the getting of the commandments, but Har Sinai represents the idea of becoming servants of God. What's the idea behind Karbanos? The Rambam says that Karbanos is because to wean the Jewish people over idolatry. Now we find it's very interesting that Avram Avinu, the first mizbechos, the first altars that he made, it doesn't mention that he gave Karbanos, that he gave sacrifices over it. So my uncle said, until the Akedah, which represented the idea that Karbanos is in place of man, the Ayil was in place of Yitzchak. So they did not put, the Avos did not put animals on the Mizbeach. They made the Mizbeach represented giving over to God. Noah, until the time he was allowed to eat, karbanos, animals, until time he was allowed to eat animals, he gave karbanos. But once there was a prohibition, and once they became permitted to eat animals, so Abraham refrained from giving karbanos because it had the perception of feeding God, of giving the carbon to God. And the idea of karbanos is not that we're giving the carbon to God. The idea behind karbanos is that the animals in place of God, in place of man, that the animals are in place of man. So we could say that the animals were in place of man. The idea was that the Jewish people, when the idea of karbanos was that they gave themselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Na'aseh v'nishma that the Jewish people said when they accepted the Torah, in a sense, was giving themselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, giving themselves over to God. So matter of fact, every time, to a certain degree, we could suggest that when the Jewish people gave karbanos, when they gave sacrifices, that was a form of Na'aseh v'nishma, because karbanos represents the idea of the Ayil being in place of Yitzchak, the carbon, and as the pasuk says at the beginning of Vayikra, the pasuk says, "Adam ki Yaakov mikem carbon Hashem." When you give mikem, it has to be giving over of yourself. The carbon has to be a giving over of oneself. So we could say that this was this is the idea of Matan Torah. The idea of Matan Torah was that we gave ourselves over. The idea of Matan Torah was that we gave ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Na'aseh v'nishma is giving ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The karbanos, coupled with the Na'aseh v'nishma, is giving ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that, so to a certain degree, in the Mishkan, the Jewish people became avodim, became servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They gave themselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was what Moshe Rabbeinu was told. You will serve me, meaning you will become my servants, on this mountain. So I think that so to a certain degree, even according to the Rambam Shita, the Beis Hamikdash is the perpetuation of Matan Torah, because the essence of Matan Torah was the idea that we give ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the essence of Matan Torah. that we belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, since that's the essence of Matan Torah. So the Beis Din Hagadol, and it's at Matan Torah, the Torah was given through Moshe Rabbeinu, both the Torah Shebetzav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the Beis Din Hagadol that represents Moshe Rabbeinu also had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, which was the perpetuation of Matan Torah, of the Naaseh B'Nishma. And once we say that, so we could suggest that it's true that the Aron was not a Klei HaMikdash. The Aron was carried outside the Beis HaMikdash. It was when they went to war, when they traveled in the Midbar. When the Aron was carried, it had a function outside the Beis HaMikdash. The other Kalim, even though in the desert it was carried, but it was carried to be part of the Beis HaMikdash. The Aron was carried not just to be part of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash was just one of its places that it was to be put. But the Aron was taken to war. It was taken to other places as well. But the Aron, the idea, I think, of the Beis HaMikdash, according to the Rambam, was, and this is why the baden, the stabs, couldn't be taken out of the Aron at any point. I think the Beis HaMikdash, according to the Rambam, represented not just Matan Torah, but it represented the Jewish people going through the Midbar and coming to Eretz Yisrael. The fact that inside the Kodesh Kodashim by the Aron, you had the Mata Aron. The fact that you had the Mun, the Tzintzenes Haman, that was placed in the Beis HaMikdash. So in a sense, that represented not just Matan Torah, but it's the traversing of the Midbar, the miracles that were done to the Jewish people by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Midbar. So in a sense, the Beis HaMikdash is perpetuating not just Matan Torah, the Beis HaMikdash is perpetuating the Jewish people traversing the Midbar. And so Mamela, the Aron, when it was carried in the Midbar, was not carried just as a Klei HaMikdash. The Aron was carried because of its independent status. It was the place where the Luchos was. So because of that, the stabs had to be kept in, even when the Aron was addressed in the Beis HaMikdash. So because of that's the idea of the Aron. The Aron, according to the Rambam, it does represent Matan Torah, but it's not just Matan Torah. It's the Jewish people traversing throughout the whole Midbar. I got confused for a second by the other Kalim. It mentions Vasisa, and by the Aron and by the Beis Hamikdash and by the mitzvah making the Mishkan, it says Va'asu in the plural form. So, in other words, Va'asu represents the idea it's for all Klal Yisrael, it's all the Mefarshim, for all of the Jewish people. The responsibility of building the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, was a mitzvah on the tzibor on all Klal Yisrael, and the responsibility of him building a Aron was also on all of the Jewish people. So it's for us in the plural form. Now, according to the Rambam, the making of the utensils, that was part of the mitzvah of making the Beis HaMikdash also. Since it was part of the mitzvah, so when it says Vasisa, it's not talking about a specific mitzvah. That's all included. If Mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, they should make for me a mikdash in the plural form. It's an obligation on the Jewish people, but not all the Jewish people were making every single utensil. So it was in the singular form. V'asisa shulchan atzei shitim. You'll make a shulchan. You'll make a menorah. So there it talks an individual because it's talking about the one who's going to do the actual work, that's going to make it. But that's just a that's just part of the general mitzvah of asuli mishkan of asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'solcham, which is in the plural form. But the Aron has its own vasu. Why? Because the making of the Aron is a separate mitzvah. It doesn't come within the mitzvah of va'asu li mikdash. It's a separate mitzvah. So it's a mitzvah on all of the Jewish people to make sure there is an Aron there. So that's why it's va'asu by the Aron, and it's va'asu by the Mikdash, by the Mishkan. But all the other utensils, it's just vasisa, because they are just details in the mitzvah of asuli mikdash. Okay, if there are any questions, I will take them now.
Can you please put them in the chat? Did the Brisker Rav quote your grandfather about?
Yeah,
or was it? Because Rishimos also says it. Your uncle also says it.
Okay.
That Moshe was only like the Sanhedrin Gadol when he had two other people with him.
Two other people. Okay, could be. I don't know what the Rishimo says, but I did see it years ago. And I think one of the sets of notes, because there are a lot of sets of notes, I think was on the Chumash Yirim. So that in the Rambam, it's interesting. The Rambam talks Moshe Beis Dino. So the question is, when he talks about Moshe Beis Dino, who is Moshe Beis Dino? But we could say, according to my uncle, Moshe Beis Dino is that. Also, we could say Rashi in Brachas, the David HaMelech, when he went to war, so he told them to consult with Sanhedrin. And Rashi says to consult with Sanhedrin, that Sanhedrin should be mispalel. So where do we find a halacha that Sanhedrin has to be mispalel daven for them? So I was thinking, some of the Mefarshim, the later Achronim, point out that at that time the war was with the Gedur Amalekim. There was a group of Amalekite soldiers who would cause trouble for the Jewish people. So David HaMelech, so the people, and that caused financial trouble for the Jewish people. So David HaMelech, so the war was against this battalion, I guess, of Amalekites. So because of this, because of this, they went to war. Now we find by Amalek that Moshe, Aaron, and Hur. So we could say that at that point, that Moshe, Aaron, and Hur, they had a din, because Moshe was there. They had a din like Bezdin Hagadol. They had a din like Bezdin Hagadol. So that was the basis for using for Rashi suggesting in Brachas that the Bezdin Hagadol should be mispalo, because just like there was Moshe, Aaron, and Hur, who had a din of Bezdin Hagadol together. So Bezdin Hagadol has to be mispalo when the Jewish people go to war, especially if it's war against Amalekites.
So because it's Pesumei Nisan Hanukkah, do we have an obligation to tell over what happened?
If you don't know what happened and you think it's candles like in a birthday cake, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Knowledge of the miracle is important. It doesn't mean that you have to go into all the details, but that's the reason why the Rambam mentions it. It's my uncle points out in his shiurim that the reason he doesn't mention the reasons for Purim is because the Megillah tells us, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Torah tells us, but the Rambam writes that a person should be able to use his sefer after they read Torah Shebechsav. So Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Torah Shebechsav. So he had to point out the reasons for the miracle of Hanukkah.
The Ramban says in this week's Parsha that the purpose of the knobs and flowers and all those parts of the menorah is very hidden. What should the menorah represent for us?
Well, menorah represents, well, according to the Rambam, if you're asking me about the Rambam Mar Nevuchim says the menorah was there in order. Of course, this is not the Ramban's opinion. He says it was to create a certain sense of awe in the Beis Hamikdash, and some say the light of the menorah is what penetrated through the windows of the Beis Hamikdash. That the light from the inside goes on the outside, but it represents that. Some say it represents chachma, knowledge, illumination, understanding. Others say that it represents the idea of probably the in creation, that there was light, because the Mishkan represents light. According to the Miri and Mishlei, so the 3 candles on one side, 3 candles on the other side, the 6 candles represent Chachma, knowledge, and the middle candle represents the Torah. And the 3 candles go towards the Torah, in the sense that the knowledge is important, but knowledge is subservient to Chachmas HaTorah, to the wisdom of the Torah. So that's what the Miri and Mishlei says. So that's
also Rabbeinu Bachaya in Pirkei Avos, your father said.
Okay, all right. I remember my father saying the Miri and Mishlei. Okay. That's okay. Any other questions?
No, other than Nelma.
Huh?
When I asked that that the Ramban says it's Nelma hidden, he thinks it's lost to us. But it probably means it's Kabbalistic.
Nelma is it might be lost to us only because we don't understand. But the idea of the menorah, I think perhaps the pictures of flowers and all that I would think that it has something to do with the idea, especially if we represent Chachma. So I can't say about every design, but the flowers on the menorah could, in a sense, add to this idea, because the whole Beis Hamikdash represented nature, represented the world, and the person by looking into the Chachma, according to the Rambam, of nature. So someone comes to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu there. So by looking into nature, so about the knobs and everything else, I would have to look to see what the Mefarshim say. I don't know.
Again, and Moshe had a hard enough time figuring out how to make it. So certainly we would have a hard time.
I don't have a fire to throw it into.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Everyone have a good week. God willing, we'll see everyone next week.